So Camilla Robuschi from University of Trento in Italy is going to speak next on the aesthetic dimension as a demonstration of continuity between nature and culture and human beings. So Camilla, are you ready?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. I'm very thankful to be here, even if online, another year, but okay. Let's begin. My presentation, can I share the screen? Just a second. Can you see it? Okay. So, my presentation aims to explore how biosemiotics can inform us about the aesthetic processes that lead to the creation of a work of art. As we shall see, these processes have a characteristic of being semiotic and to take place not only among human beings, but also, and at different levels, among non-human animals. Accordingly, one of the main purposes of this presentation is to show how a study of aesthetic processes can be useful for the demonstration of the continuity between nature and culture in human beings. The topic on the continuity and relationship between art or aesthetics and nature is not new. Indeed, it can be stated to have originated with the birth of philosophy. One of the major points of contention between Plato and Aristotle was precisely the relationship that the work of art has with nature. While Plato relegates the arts to the level of technique without learning, that is, stimulation without knowledge, as opposed to the idea understood as a cognitive purity, Aristotle argued that the art is always imitation, or better known as mimesis, of nature. The advance of the philosophy of Aristotle on Platonic idealism is to consider mimesis not as a simple simulation of what the sense organs grasp from the nature, but as a process that leads to the knowledge and the modelization of the surrounding environment. Such process results in the work of art. Platonic idealism has had various disciplines also concerning the aesthetic theory, but we can find other examples of scholars that continue along the Aristotelian line of thought that is of most interest for the present analysis, since a continuity between nature and culture must be sought in the work of art, or rather in the aesthetic processes that lead to it. In this respect, one of the most interesting authors, but perhaps the last known, is Carl Philip Morris. Hence, his aesthetic theory set out in a particularly systematic way in his, Morris is a German writer and essayist that it starts from an idea of nature as a whole, made up of links and relation. And from here, his aesthetic theory, set out in a particularly systematic way in his 1788 paper, Über die bildende Nachahmung des Schönen, that is translated into English under the title Concerning the Creative Imitation of Beautiful. Here, a passage from the book concerning the creative imitation of the beautiful that I want to read because, in my opinion, is very powerful also from a literary point of view. And so translated in English is any beautiful wall from the hand of a formative artist is thus an impression in miniature of the highest beauty of the great wall of nature, that after all still indirectly recreates nature through the formative hand of the artist, that which was not directly part of its great plan. So, in summary, what Morris states is that human beings are only able to grasp the single relationship of nature, with the exception of the artist, who is able to grasp beauty, which must be understood on the one hand as an autonomous totality, but on the other hand as a reflection of a cognitive macrocosm, that is the reflection of nature. In other words, normally nature cannot be perceived as a whole by our senses, except for the process of creation that leads to the work of art that imitates the same process used by nature as creator. To conclude this very brief excursus, the importance of Morris' thought in this context is that the analogy between the aesthetic process and the processes that occur in nature is upheld. Another very popular scholars whose aesthetics theory I wanted to briefly present is Henri Faucon. Is a French historian that in 1934 he wrote a small book entitled Vie des Formes, that translated in English is translated into English under the title Life of Forms in Art. And in this book, it starts from the premise that what we call natural life is actually a relationship between forms. And from that, he develops his aesthetic theory. The work of art, according to Faucon, fits fully into these systems of relation of forms, in the sense that the formal relation within a work of art and between different works of art is a metaphor for the functioning of the universe, of the entire universe. In other words, art follows the same tendencies as the universe. That is, it follows the tendency of the natural world, in that it is a set of formal relationships. Although starting from other assumptions than those of Morris, also in Faucon, we can see how prevails a similarity between the aesthetic process and the creative nature, where the artist has the advantage of being an observer of the process itself from a very privileged perspective. Another aesthetic theory that fits perfectly into the debate about the relation of continuity between aesthetics or art and nature is the better known thesis of American philosopher John Dewey. And here a passage from Art and Experience. So, in his famous book, in his famous 1934 book, Art and Experience, the aim of Dewey was to find a place for aesthetic within the more general experience that human beings have of the world. Dewey's turning point lies in the fact that he wants to trace the origins of aesthetics in experience, as not as many scholars before him have done in the work of art, which in his view is no more than one of the possible products of aesthetic experience. It is not a coincidence that his thought is defined as naturalistic pragmatism. In particular, aesthetic experience is one of the highest moments of human experience because it simulates the fundamental process between organism and its environment. Aesthetic experience, in other words, is identified by Dewey as the disruptive phase that necessarily alternates with the phases of ordered relationships that the organism must establish with its environment if it is to ensure its survival. The last two examples I would like to present on the topic of continuity between aesthetics and nature can only be taken from the semiotic world and are Charles Peirce and Yuri Lotman. Regarding Peirce, I submit here in the slide a passage from his lecture on pragmatism and pragmaticism. The subject of the lecture is the correct method for studying the phenomenon, which according to Peirce must be based on three faculties or skills that the scholar should acquire. The first skill to acquire is actually the one that an artist already has. That is the ability to see things as they really are, as they appear before the eyes. One could almost say, without wanting to force piercing reasoning, that the artist is one who, more than others, manages to grasp the firstness, so the iconic dimension. Last but not least, Lotman, who in his 1967 paper, quoted and translated by Professor Kuhl in the article Towards Biosemiotics with Yuri Lotman, in this paper, it suggests a similarity between the process leading to the cultural constitution of literary work and that leading to the biological constitution of the cell. We can read here the relationship. The sentence of Lotman is very strong because it claims that relationships between the artistic idea and the construction of a literary work reminds one of the relationship between life and the biological structure of a cell. So, the idea that artistic process, even in cultural realm, is part of the same creative experience of nature is already present in several scholars who deal with aesthetics or are in close contact with it. In other words, artists are those who, to the full extent, embodies natural processes because they are immersed in them and grasp their deepest connections. These theories, however, are thought an excellent starting point for reasoning on the continuity between nature and culture in aesthetics, are still at a pioneering level and lack sometimes homogeneity and sometimes even coherence. In order to overcome this limitation, I believe worthwhile to integrate them with the tools and the theoretical background provided by a transdisciplinary field of study such as biosemiotics, which allows us to extend semiosis and accordingly aesthetics to all the living beings. In particular, some questions to be considered in order to build a more coherent aesthetic theory are these four, in my opinion. The first one is, what do we mean by the concept of aesthetic experience or aesthetic process? Should it be limited to the cultural and symbolic human sphere, or can we also find traces of it in other living beings? And in this context, it would also be necessary to clarify what is meant by natural in aesthetics. The second question is closely linked to the first, and is, does the work of art encompass the whole aesthetics experience, or is it only one of its potential cultural specific products? The third one is aesthetic limited to the experience of beauty? And the last one is, how can the aesthetic experience enhance the modelization of the surrounding? The question that underpins all this is precisely the latter, since it is first and foremost essential to demonstrate that aesthetic experience is a modeling system. That is, it enables the creation of models of the surrounding. Of particular interest in this context is the modeling system theory by Seebeck and Marcel Danesi, through which they describe three main modeling systems along the lines of firstness, secondness, and thirdness. In the light of this theory, we must therefore ask ourselves where to place aesthetic among the three main modeling systems. The systems that interest us more are the primary, which in its iconic nature is the basis for all the others, and it is in common with all the living beings, and the tertiary, which is symbolic and prevalent in the human realm. The primary modeling system, and I quote from the book The Forms of Meaning by Seebeck and Danesi, can be characterized as the modeling system that allows organisms to simulate something in a specific ways. This system is considered by the two biosemiotics iconic in the sense that it consists of the ability to grasp some differences within the own world and then synthesize them through similarity. What I want to underline here is that this way to interface with the own world is not only the basic modeling for the survival of all living beings, but it's also like that of aesthetic. As Seebeck claims in the essay Prefigurements of Art, here a passage, the grasping of what he defines likeness tempered with by irregularity or difference is the basis of aesthetic process. It follows that aesthetic is not something irrelevant or unimportant, but rather a real tool for survival that allows the classification of the surrounding through the grasping of similitudes and differences. In Prefigurements of Art, indeed, Seebeck set out to research aesthetic behavior not only in human beings, but also in other non-human animals, and after considering a wide variety of examples of aesthetic science divided into four main categories that are kinesthetic, musical, pictorial, and architecture, Seebeck concludes that the aesthetic is common to all living beings and is characterized as a vital classification of the surrounding that occurs through the recognition of meaningful similarities and differences. Such behavior corresponds to what he will describe in his later modeling system theory as the primary modeling system. To classify that means above all to connect the elements of the world, to see its deeper relationship, a quality that had already been attributed by Morris to the artist, but which is also confirmed by Gregory Bateson. Bateson, in Mind and Nature, defines aesthetic as responsive to the pattern which connects, where the elements to be connected are first and foremost mind and nature. The fact that non-human animals are involved in the aesthetic process does not mean that are able to carve the Velvet Christ by Giuseppe Sammartino from a piece of marble. To sketch an answer to the second question, this is only possible in a symbolic space-specific human realm, that is, that of the tertiary modeling system. This modeling system is indeed described by Zibok and Danesi as, I quote, the ability to extend form to stand for abstract reference freely without any apparent sensory connection between the form and the reference. It also entails the ability to utilize forms creatively and resourcefully. Tertiary modeling is especially prevalent in the human realm. So, it also should not be forgotten, however, that the three modeling systems were conceived by Zibok and Danesi not as singular units, but in relation to each other. In this way, the tertiary is dependent on the primary modeling system, which is its basis. In other words, and in conclusion, the work of art does not arise out of nothing in a purely symbolic context, but find its origins in the primary, a modeling system that is in common to all other living beings, thus confirming the continuity between culture and nature also in aesthetics. I finished.
Thank you, Camilla. Yeah, so probably don't, questions, thoughts. And let's try to take two. Philip, is your hand raised?
Hello, Camilla. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I would like to mention Adolf Portman. I don't know if you know his work, because some of your Italian colleagues, I'm sure they know. For example, Pietro Conte has wrote and prefaced to Italian version of Animal Forms and Patterns. So what do you think about his aesthetic morphology, about the possibility of aesthetic forms without spectators, even without animal spectators, like some kind of natural beauty per se?
Okay, Philip, thank you for the question. I'm Italian, but I don't know Portman very much. So I'm in difficulty to answer the question. What do you mean by natural beauty?
He is known for aesthetic morphology. So he would animal species display some kind of appearances which are beautiful, even if there is not human observer. And in some of his thoughts, he would go even farther, that there don't have to be even observers from other living beings, but the forms of nature are beautiful per se. It's basically against Darwinian sexual selection and so on.
Okay, yeah, I try to answer the question with Zibok and with the book Prefigurements of Art. That is, the title is Prefigurements of Art, because Zibok claims that there is a boundary between art and prefigurements of art. So Zibok makes a lot of examples of so-called natural beauty. For example, he makes the example of the nest of some birds that is particularly beauty and particularly aesthetic relevant for us and also not for us human beings. But he say this is a boundary, and this boundary is that the human beings as the symbolic dimension, that in prefigurements of art, he don't call symbolic dimension, but the book says that the human beings have the non-verbal and verbal dimension instead of the animals. So that of the animals are prefigurements of art, and only that of human being is art because of this verbal and verbal dimension. So that, and after the, okay, the morphological discourse is it's a very big discourse, and we have to go on the single scholar and take it as example or so on.
Thank you.
I think one more question. Do we have another question out there? Okay, well, I've got one. The piece that you brought in that mentions my father and responsiveness, looking at aesthetic as responsiveness to the pattern that connects. I think this is, you know, it's a deceptively simple quote, because there's an awful lot in there. Responsiveness is a big piece. And aesthetic is a big piece, and the pattern which connects is a big piece. So it's, you know, it looks like, okay, fine, but actually it's probably worth taking a moment to really think about what that is, because I think it ties into, first of all, so much of what we've been speaking about today, of these things that are connecting, and that connection, of course, is filled with abductive process, relational process. So looking at aesthetic as the possibility for responsiveness in that is also recognizing that, for me, this is one of the things I see, and that is that, in fact, the aesthetic, which I consider to be more than just beauty, but includes tone and texture, flavor, sensibility, rhythm, the sense, whatever you want to think about that as, that the possibility for response is inside that aesthetic set of limitations. And I think in human terms, we can talk about that in for example, the way you might come into a room, like a conference, okay? And a conference in which there is a particular aesthetic of communication happening. And if you are able to perceive that aesthetic and produce, it is giving you the limitations of what's possible to communicate. And I think that's the piece that we don't want to miss there, is that aesthetic, you know, the possibility of responding is limited by the aesthetic. So I think it's otherwise everything that gets expressed is going to be in relation to that aesthetic, right? If you come into a conference like this and start singing hardcore punk rock, okay, what you're getting is not hardcore punk rock. You're getting the relationship between hardcore punk rock and the tonality of the conference. So no matter what you do, that aesthetic is giving you the limitations of what, not what is said, but what could be said, what could be responded, what could be communicated, what could be sutured in. Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you for your comments. It will be very useful for me because it's my PhD research, and yeah, the topic is very large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camilla.